Darren's parents stood by his bedroom door with flat, forced smiles and exhausted eyes. They were still wearing their funeral best, her in a black shin-length dress and him in a matching suit and tie. His father had his arm around his mother, who was obviously trying hard not to break down in front of their son, who was laying in bed, having already changed out of his best little suit and into his plaid pajamas. Darren was almost 10 years old, so they didn't want to sugarcoat the devastation that comes with losing a beloved grandparent, but they also wanted to show a good example of strength in hard times. Darren looked up to them, figuratively, as the oldest of 2 children, and, literally, waiting on what they would have to say to him after such a day. "Darren, honey," his mother began, her voice thin and overused. "Your mama loved you and Susie so much." She paused, choking on her words before a quick swallow and a big breath. "So much. She loved y'all more than anything in the whole world. Now I know she was very sick for a very long time, but I want you to promise me that you will remember her like she was before she got sick. Okay? Please. Please remember her like she used to be. Okay?" Darren sat up in his bed, nodding, with his mouth slowly downturning. He hated seeing his parents so upset. At his almost 10 years, he could only count on one hand how many times he'd seen either of them cry. You and your sister meant everything to her, and I don't want you to ever forget that. Now I know today was so hard, but you were so brave. She left her husband's arm and walked over to Darren's bed, leaning down and stroking his hair. "So brave, and I know Susie saw that. You were such a good role model for her today. Darren, I'm so proud of you and the young man you're becoming. You're gonna need to continue to be her rock." "Buddy," Darren's dad chimed in, still standing by the door. It wasn't his own mother's funeral, but he was torn up, though not showing it, and wanted to offer some final words as well. "She's always looked up to you. Son, you're 5 years older than her, which doesn't seem like a lot. But to her, it's like a lifetime of experience between you two. She's gonna need you to lean on in times like this. Okay?" "Okay, Dad," Darren answered, closing his eyes as his mother continued to stroke his short brown hair. "You're such a perfect child." "Honey," his mother said, smiling much more convincingly, "I don't know what we ever did to deserve you and Susie. Y'all are our little angels. We love you so much. And so did your mama. And now she's a real angel, and she'll always look after you and smile down on you from heaven." She kissed Darren's forehead and stood back up, walking back toward the door and her husband, who took her back under his arm. "Now I want you to sleep well, and sleep in. Y'all have the day off of school tomorrow, and we're gonna do whatever you and Susie want." Darren perked up. That was fantastic news, the first good thing he'd heard in days. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad," he said, trying not to seem overly excited given the day's circumstances. "You're welcome. Son, we all deserve a day off. Maybe we can go to the movies or something," his father said warmly, before kissing his mother on her cheek. "Well, we love you, and Mama loved you so much. Promise me you'll never forget that, and that you'll always remember her for how she always was. Okay?" his mother reminded him. "I promise," Darren answered in a nod. "Good. Nightlight on or off?" she asked, looking down over by an unplugged little plastic football laying on the floor by the door of the bedroom closet. On please," Darren replied. He could have plugged it in himself, but the closet was only a few feet from the bedroom door, which was over by the opposite corner of the room to where his bed was. It would be a quick task for his mother. She smiled and nodded before going and plugging it in, before walking back over and putting her fingers over the main light switch to his room. "We love you, son. Rest well," she said as only a good mother could. "Love you, buddy. Hope you get some sleep," his father added, before opening the door and beginning his way down the hallway. His mother offered one last big, close-lipped smile before she flipped off the light and exited as well, closing the door behind her. Finally alone after the longest day he can remember, Darren was able to collect his thoughts. He laid back in his bed and pulled the grey comforter up to his collarbone. He breathed deeply, finally in a more relaxed state. The small football-shaped light shot pale blue beams sharply up the wall, and then residually around his room, like moonlight on a cloudy night. He looked around his safe place. It was the only bedroom he'd ever known, but had everything an almost 10-year-old boy could need. By his bed was a small table topped with a lamp. In its drawer were football cards and Yu-Gi-Oh cards alike, along with pencils and even wrappers from a few sneakily eaten candy bars. Across the room from his cornered bed was a TV, which he thought about turning on, but decided he was too exhausted and didn't want to make noise. There next to the TV was the closet door, with a "No Girls Allowed" sign hanging proudly. To the right of Darren's bed, eye to eye with the closet, was another door that led out to the wraparound porch that tightly hugged his one-story home. It had a window that let in some natural light. Since no night is completely dark, Darren didn't mind, at least not anymore. When he was younger, he had wished there wasn't a window there, his growing imagination telling him that all sorts of terrifying monsters were looking in on him as he slept. But now he had outgrown those childish fears, at least for the most part. The nightlight was still a comforting friend, though his parents didn't seem to mind that he still asked for it to stay on. In fact, the only person who ever lovingly teased him about it was his mummo. Mummo, Darren had almost forgotten. He laid there, staring at the pale lit ceiling, with a deep mixture of feelings. He missed Mama so much. He missed the old Mama, the version his mother had asked him to remember. She was always so sweet and playful with him and Susie. Then, a couple years ago, her husband, Darren's papa, had died. Soon after, Mama got sick. At first, she kept her spirits up, still sneaking treats and sly winks to him and Susie when they would all visit her in the hospital. Eventually, though, she got worse, way worse. So bad that Darren and Susie could only visit her on her best days, which were far from good. Burned into his memory were the visions of her in the hospital bed, rail-thin, with sunken, dark eyes and frail, wispy white hair. When she wasn't asleep, she would either groan in severe pain or talk about insane things, like how witches from hell were coming to drag her down with them. It frightened Darren so badly that he began to not want to visit her anymore. He would pretend to be sick so that he couldn't go to the hospital, and his parents and little sister would go without him. Luckily, he didn't think Susie could really process it, as she never seemed scared of Mama and only ever talked about her as if she had never changed from the sweet grandmother she once was. He did go one last time, though it was only a few days before she died. Just about a week from this night, she was in bed as usual, except she was laid on her side in a strange, twisted way that made her look almost inhuman. Her back was warped and hunched, her arms curled up to her chin, with all her fingers spindly and outstretched, like she was holding on to two invisible apples. Her mouth was downturned, baring her yellowed teeth in an excruciating scowl. In between nauseating moans, she would try and inhale, making a horrible rattling noise. Darren remembered seeing his mother leaning down and holding her, sobbing deeply with her head on Mama's shoulder. Darren was replaying in his head the last terrible sounds he ever heard Mama make, when a real-life noise suddenly broke through the silence of his room. Shh! Shh! Come in! Come in! Darren, come in! A static electric voice shot out from under his bed. He reached down there and pulled up a small walkie-talkie that his dad had given Susie and him. They hadn't used them in forever, so it startled Darren. He was surprised the batteries had still worked. He pressed it to his mouth. Hello? Hello? He asked. Darren. Hey, it's Susie. I'm so glad the walkie-talkies still work. I know it's you, silly, Darren playfully teased. What's up? I can't sleep. I miss Mama so much, and Mom forgot to read to me. Darren closed his eyes as hard as he could, trying to stifle tears that at this point would be painful to shed. His little sister sounded so defeated, even if in her own sweet little way. He was thankful that she was reaching out to him. I know. Susie, I miss Mama too, and Mom's just really sad, but I'm sure she'll remember to read to you tomorrow night. Yeah, I hope so, Susie said softly. I can't believe Mom's an orphan now. Yeah, I can't imagine how she's feeling. Darren didn't feel like correcting her. Yeah. Hey, come wave at me through the magic window. Please? We haven't done that in forever, she pleaded. Up until about 3 years ago, Darren and Susie had shared the room that he used now. When their parents decided that the siblings needed their own personal space, Susie moved into the guest bedroom right next to Darren's room, sharing the wall where his TV was put in. Susie had a hard time adjusting to being alone, so their dad had a small porthole window installed between their rooms, in the back of Darren's closet. If Susie was scared, she could simply knock on the wall, and Darren would go to his closet and turn on the light and show his face in the little plate-sized window and wave at her. She could clearly see him from her bed, and this would make her feel safe. They hadn't used the porthole window in quite some time, but Darren didn't see any reason not to use it tonight. Okay, I can do that. Give me 1 second, he said, leaving his bed and walking to his closet, walkie-talkie still in hand. He opened the door, turned the light on, and swiped hangers of clothes out of the way until he saw the small circular window. He leaned down to stick his face in view. All he saw was darkness. Susie, can you see me?
I'm here.
Yes, I see you.
Hey!
She answered excitedly. I can't see you. Turn on your lamp, silly, Darren teased. A couple seconds later, there was a small burst of light, and he could see Susie nestled in her tiny bed, one hand holding the walkie-talkie to her ear and the other lowering from under the lamp. There you go.
Hey, Susie.
Darren squeezed a waving hand into the porthole so that she could see. She flashed him a big, snaggle-toothed smile and sat up, pushing down her light pink comforter and hanging her little legs over the side of her bed, kicking them in relieved excitement from seeing her hero, her older brother. She was wearing white silk pajamas with a pink heart on the chest. The lamplight accentuated her platinum blonde hair, making it glow like neon against a mostly dark bedroom. All Darren could really see was her and her bed and bedside table, and the blurry shadowed area behind her where her closet was. He was glad she had asked him to use the magic window. Though, for this moment, everything suddenly seemed just like it was years ago, when they were even smaller, when there was no sadness in their lives. Yay, I've missed the magic window, Susie softly squealed. Me too. It's been a long time, Darren said, using his pajama sleeve to clear up the quickly fogging glass. Oh, Darren, look what I found, Susie blurted. Before hopping off her bed and to the drawer in her bedside table, she slid it open and reached in, closing her fist around something small. She held up a yellow, translucent stone to the lamplight. It's the special rock that Mama gave me.
I found it.
What special rock? Darren inquired, not remembering ever seeing the thing. She gave it to me one time when me and Mom and Dad visited her. You were sick, I think. She slowly turned the stone under the lamp with her thumb and index finger. Darren could see it gleam and sparkle in all of its tiny, yellow glory. She said that if I hold it in my hand and wish really, really hard, then she would be right there with me, no matter where I am. Darren couldn't help but send a warm smile through the window as he watched how dearly she held the little gift. That's very sweet of her to give that to you. She loved you very much, Susie. Hold on tight to that rock and don't lose it again. She loved you too. And yes, I will keep it forever and ever and never lose it. I'm gonna wish on it really, really hard. That's great. Now listen, it's kind of hard to keep bending down to the magic window, Darren said, putting a hand to his young, but straining back. I'm gonna go back to my bed now. But if you want, we can talk on our walkie-talkies tomorrow night. Okay, thank you, Darren, Susie replied, still holding the walkie-talkie to her mouth and the stone to the lamplight. She hadn't so much as glanced at Darren since she pulled it out of her drawer. Go to bed. Susie, we have a long day of movies and ice cream tomorrow. Okay, fine. Good night. She clicked off her light, keeping the stone in her hand and not returning it to the drawer. After a couple of seconds, her own little night light flashed on, her having to crane down almost to the floor to plug it in. It cast her room into a faint, sunset orange hue. Her dark outline gave Darren a wave and then curled up under he covers. Darren gave her one last brotherly smirk before he removed his face from the porthole and backed out of his closet, fixing his clothes hangers back how they were and turning the light off. He left the door cracked and walked back over and into his bed heavily. He was once again alone with his confused thoughts. The dim blue glow of the room helped soothe him over, though, and soon his eyes were closed, his sleepy equilibrium gently rocking back and forth like a boat in a no-wake zone. Soon, the intentional pictures in his mind became more obscure and more vivid, and he gradually slipped past the edge of memory and into dreams. Shh, Darren. Shh, Darren.
Wake up!
Shh, Darren, wake up. He was snapped back into consciousness by the whisper yelling of Susie on the walkie-talkie. He inhaled deeply through his nose and stretched out his arms before turning and reaching back under his bed and picked up the little two-way. He felt like he had been hit by a bus, having been interrupted from the deepest part of his night's sleep. Susie, what time is it? He slurred, rubbing his right eyelid with his thumb. I don't know. I just woke up.
There's scratching on my door.
I think someone's at my door, Darren,
I'm scared.
she said desperately. Darren perked up for a second, but then relaxed once he had a simple explanation for her. It's just Matilda. Susie. She just wants to get in. Their family's cat, a large calico named Matilda, was notorious for acting much more like a dog than your average feline, scratching on and even opening doors using her long limbs and big paws. She did this all the time, enough to where locked doors were seemingly her only true boundaries. I don't know, Darren. She always sleeps in Mom and Dad's room. Can you please go look? Please. Her softened voice truly sounded unsettled. Darren banged the back of his head on his pillow out of slight annoyance. Come on, Susie. I was sleeping so well. Please, Darren. I'm begging you. I won't be able to sleep if you don't, and I'm too scared to look. Darren sighed hard, inconvenienced, but trying to remember his role as a caring older brother. His little sister was scared and needed to be her hero. Okay, Susie. Hold on one sec, he said calmly. Oh, thank you. Thank you, she responded with sharp relief. He slowly got out of bed, leaving the walkie-talkie behind, and stumbled to his door. Still drunk with sleep, he could only barely see the doorknob in the low light. He turned it before a sound made him freeze and flex his hand on the down-turned knob. Scratching, just like Susie had said. He leaned in and pressed his left ear to the door. It was similar to Matilda's eager swipes, except it was slower and heavier, way slower and way heavier, like someone was repeatedly scraping a rake down the wall. Darren felt his heartbeat pick up. For Susie, he thought to himself, hand still flexed on the knob. He slowly pulled his door open, mostly hiding behind it as he did, save for enough room to see the hallway. The scratching stopped before he could squint and get a look at a shadow moving slowly away from Susie's door and down the ever-dark corridor. His eyes woke up instantly. He didn't get a good look, but whatever it was bigger than a cat. At least he thought. He blinked hard and shut his door quickly, stopping and slowing his movement just before it closed so he could keep it quiet. He walked, but way more consciously back to his bed than he was when he left it. He sat on his bed for a moment, unsure of what to tell Susie. He truly didn't get a grasp of what it could be. Shadows stretch in the middle of the night, and tired eyes are unreliable narrators for the mind. It very well may have just been Matilda. Picking up the walkie-talkie, Darren made an executive decision. Hey, I just looked and it was Matilda. I saw her run down the hall toward Mom and Dad's room. There's nothing to worry about. Oh, okay, good, Susie breathed with bone-deep relief. Silly Matilda. Ugh, I'm so happy it was her. I thought I had... She paused sharply. I'm just so happy it was her. Is she okay? I heard her meow and it sounded like she was sick. She looked fine to me. What do you mean she sounded sick? Darren asked. Her meow was weird. It was really low and sounded like she was hurt or something. Oh, I didn't hear that. She looked fine though. I'm sure she's okay. Darren felt strange, like he was making a mistake. Okay, good. Darren, can I ask you a huge favour? Yes? Can you read to me? Please? Pretty please? I promise just for a little bit. It will be hard to go to sleep, but I will real quick if you just read a story, Susie asked with sweet desperation. Darren looked at the clock. 3:17 a.m. Ouch. I don't think I have anything here to read that you would like. It doesn't matter. Any book will be good. I just fall asleep so easy when I hear someone read. Please, Darren. Well, the sleep was already ruined, but they could sleep in as long as they want, per their parents' approval. So Darren sighed and reached into his bedside drawer and felt around. His hand found a small book in the back corner, and he pulled it out, holding it to his face in the dim nightlight. He exhaled in a small laugh. I have the Bible. Will that work? Yeah, sure. Oh, read, do not worry. Please. That's Mama's favorite. She used to read that to us all the time, remember? Oh, I remember. Darren knew exactly what she meant and turned to Philippians chapter 4. Thank you so much, Susie said, already sounding sleepier. Sure. Okay, Philippians chapter 4. Darren began. He read to her for several minutes, using one hand to talk to her and the other to hold open the Bible. He read all of chapter 4 and even got halfway through chapter 5. The words were calming to him. The timeless message touched him, making his heart smile softly and made him see his circumstances through a lens much bigger than his own perception. After he realized he had read more than he intended to, he paused, listening for anything coming from Susie's end. There was only silence. It was true. She had always enjoyed being read to, and usually went out like a candle quickly, even if it was during the day. Darren felt warm, happy to have helped her fall back asleep. He laid back on his pillow, still holding the walkie-talkie and the Bible in his hands. He exhaled for several seconds before raising back up and putting the Bible back in his drawer. He looked over to his closet. He forgot he had left the door cracked. He decided he would go shut it, and before that he would peek into the magic window to make sure Susie was asleep. He got up and walked over to the closet and creaked open the door. He winced, not wanting to wake his sister up with any unnecessary noise, and silently pushed aside his hanging clothes again. He leaned down to the porthole and stuck his squinting eyes in. He heard himself gasp as deep as his lungs could hold. The muscles in his chest and shoulders flexed to the point of pain, and the back of his scalp felt like his hair was trying to escape his head. There, in the low orange light of Susie's room, right behind her bed, was the silhouette of a person. The sickeningly thin, shadowed outline had arms with elbows raised and hands unnaturally bent to the sides, with bony fingers stretched and locked like half-plucked black feathers. Its back was crooked, and its head was unnaturally cocked to the left with a dark cloud of transparent, wispy hair. It was reaching a warped arm down to Susie, who was laying still in her bed, fast asleep. Darren looked on in horror, shocked into silence, still not having exhaled from his gasp. He kicked his right leg back and his heel caught a shoebox, making him lose his balance and fall backwards and out of his closet. He shot back up and threw himself back to the porthole and pressed his brow to the glass. There was nothing there. No horrible silhouette, no broken limbs grabbing for Susie, nothing. Only a comfortable orange glow surrounding a cozy bed, holding a sleeping little girl. Darren exhaled finally, scanning all he could see of the rest of her room in the warm low light. He craned his neck to get a look toward her bedroom door. The soft shadows of her room gave way to a tall, slim column of pitch black. Her door was cracked, spilling in darkness from the hallway. He could feel his heartbeat in his neck. No, his eyes had not lied to him, nor his ears. The only deceit was his own, when he convinced Susie that the only nocturnal visitor to her room was the cat, Matilda. Against his own will, Darren knew he had to act. Whatever was trying to get to Susie wasn't going to stop. He had to be her rock in this moment. He would go to her room, wake her up, and they would then go wake their parents up, and he would tell them exactly what he saw, even if it sounded insane. His little sister's safety was far more important than his 10-year-old ego or his parents' night of sleep. He exited the closet and walked over to his door, once again flexing his wrist as to hold the knob down silently. He gently pulled the door open, the dark and cooler air of the hallway washing his face. All he could see was the skinny tower of orange glow through Susie's slightly open door. His mouth felt instantly drier as he noticed dozens of scratch marks above and around her doorknob. Having opened his door wide enough to fit his body through, he weaseled himself into the hallway slowly. Eyes on Susie's room, he lowered himself and tiptoed almost halfway there, trying to avoid any unnecessary creaks in his step. When he was almost to her entrance and could see into her sleeping peacefully, he suddenly froze. Somewhere far down the long hallway came a noise, a soft noise, yet debilitating to Darren's already waning sanity. It was a sound he recognized instantly, having heard it both in real life and in his worst nightmares. A painful groan, followed by a deep, wet, rattling inhale. The sound shot down the dark hallway toward Darren like a swarm of bats. Then came slow, heavy footsteps, like someone was struggling under an almost unbearable weight. Ka-lunk, ka-lunk, ka-lunk. Darren's vocal cords were paralyzed, so the scream he let escape was entirely mental. His legs thawed first as flight mode was suddenly activated, and he shot through Susie's door like an animal escaping a cage. He slammed the door behind him, and in an instant his little sister was sat up in bed and fearfully alert. "Darren," she sweetly squeaked in her disorientation. "Susie, Susie, listen, listen. You have to listen. You are not safe. At all," Darren shouted as he ran to her bedside. "We gotta wake Mom and Dad up now. We gotta go." His plea was interrupted by the now familiar sound of a scratch at her door, which Darren had slammed shut but had forgotten to lock. One long, slow scratch, seemingly starting at the very top of the door, stopping about halfway down. Then the knob slightly twisted. Then it was jostled again, turning a little more, then again and again, until they heard a small pop, and the door just barely moaned open. Susie screamed as only 5-year-old girls can, ice cold and as piercing as a needle. She dove under her blanket instantly, forming a shuddering little pocket on top of her bed. Her cries were muffled by the fabric, but were desperate all the same. Darren was still standing at her bedside, his mind absolutely scrambling. The door was being scratched open wider and wider, inch by inch, spilling the deep dark of the hallway into the bedroom like so many gallons of oil. In a chaotic instant, Darren reached down and unplugged Susie's nightlight and fell on her bed, on top of the comforter, and put his arm around the shaking, crying little girl under the covers. There was no hiding anymore, but he could still protect her, taking the brunt of the forthcoming attack. "It's gonna be okay, Susie, okay?" he said, laying on his side and squeezing his right arm around his sweet, scared little sister. The room was pitch black now, and the door had groaned almost all the way open with a dreadful, serrated creak. "This is all my fault, Darren. All my fault," she cried. "What do you mean, Susie? No, it's not. It's all gonna be okay." Darren wasn't convincing himself, but tried his best to console her as she continued to shake under his arm. They were both roaming past the point of sane fear, and as their uninvited visitor entered the dark room, they were shocked into utter, breathless silence. Ka-lunk, ka-lunk, ka-lunk. The heavy, uneven footsteps began their way across the floor from the door to the bed. Then the horrible, nauseated moan gently called out to the children, following by that deep, painful death rattle inhale. Darren squeezed his covered little sister even harder. He felt himself sweating hard and trembling. He clamped his eyes shut until it almost hurt. He only hoped that this monster would take him, kill him, and spare little Susie. He was happy that even in this probably final moment, he still wanted to be there for her, to be her rock. Lunk. The footsteps had reached the end of her bed and were working their way over to the side where Darren was laying. The skin on his back and his neck electrified, chills screaming at him to flee. He resisted, tensing his entire body. Another groan, this time coming from right beside the bed, belted their ears, this time much louder than before, almost triumphant. Darren felt tears falling down his cheeks and tasted salt in his downturned mouth. Susie was strangely silent and had stopped shaking. Darren could hear her whispering too softly to make out what she was saying. Another dreadful moan and painful inhale stung his hearing and painted a frightful picture on his blind eyes. The thing was now standing over him. He began to feel sharp, hard, bony fingers touching his back. He made a noise like a whining dog. "I take it back. I take it back. I wish you would go away forever." Susie suddenly screamed from under the blanket. Another bony hand grabbed at Darren's turned back, clenching spindly fists around his shirt and beginning to pull at him. He just pinched his eyelids shut and gritted his teeth. Another devastated howl cried out to the children. "Go away, Mama, go away! I take it all back! I take it back!" Susie screamed, still muffled under the blanket. Another moan, this time defiant and angrier, escaped from right behind Darren's ultra-sensitive ears. The clamped hands shook at his shirt, stronger than expected. Darren began to feel himself being pulled away from his sister. He fought it, but felt himself losing the will and the ability to hold on. "Go away! Mama, go away! Now!" Susie shrieked fearfully, yet with some sense of powerful certainty. Then the ghastly voice over the children erupted into a scream, a huge, slicing scream, like a doomed wailing of the damned. The bony hands clenched on Darren's back shook violently, tearing into his shirt and pulling him harshly in all directions. The scream grew impossibly loud as Darren began to feel himself losing consciousness. He couldn't bear another moment of this blind hell. Just as he began to feel sharp nails latch onto the skin of his back, the room exploded into light, appearing red behind his clenched eyelids. "What the hell is going on?" Their mother's voice shocked their battered ears with sensitive relief. Both parents stormed into the room as if there was a raging fire. The world was still light red behind Darren's closed eyelids, but he could hear the concerned panting and quickly feel his father's hands on his shoulders comforting him. "What happened, buddy? What happened? What's wrong? What happened to your shirt?" Darren slowly cracked open his eyes. His mother was sitting on the bed holding Susie, who had buried her head in her collarbone. He looked up at his father, who was still rubbing his back and shoulders. His eyes looked confused and exhausted. Darren then twitched as he anxiously scanned the rest of the room, awaiting another ghastly attack from that evil, unwanted visitor. There was nobody else there. Whatever that thing was, it had vanished. It was only his family around him. Darren began, but couldn't get his screaming brain to calm down enough to where he could speak. "It's okay, buddy. It's okay," his father said as he sat Darren up and hugged him tightly. Darren only now realized how cold he was as he shook and rested his chin on his father's shoulder. From here he could see the magic window over on the adjoining wall to his room. Through the translucent glass, a dim light flickered pale blue. Darren clenched his eyes, not even entertaining the idea of seeing anything else that would further damage his inflamed psyche. "Susie, what is this?" he heard his mother say. After a moment, he felt his father stir and then pick him up and carry him over to the other side of the bed. He sat them both down and then turned Darren around, still keeping an arm around him. Darren opened his eyes again, seeing his mother with an arm around his sister's stomach, the other holding the small yellow stone in her hand that Susie had been cherishing earlier. His mother turned the stone in her hand, her face calm, but her eyes filled with surprise and wonder. Where did you get this, Susie? She leaned her face into Susie's, who had her head down, the way she does when she's being reprimanded. It's okay, sweetie. I just want to know. She kissed Susie's forehead. Mama gave it to me. She said it was special because I'm special too, just like her. She wanted me to have it. I'm so sorry, Mom. Susie began to cry and turned back into her mother's chest and hugged her tightly. Shh, shh, shh. It's okay, sweetie. Darren looked up at his father's face. His eyes were glued on the stone in his wife's hand, which was in half a fist as she rubbed Susie's back. The look he gave was a still concern, eerily similar to when a really bad storm was about to come over the house or when his favorite football team misses a field goal. I thought we were past this, Julia, he said flatly, obviously trying to keep his frightened children calm. She met his gaze and something lit up in her eyes. She glanced away, bringing Susie back out onto the bed so they could be face to face. Susie, listen to me. Susie wiped her damp eyes and raised her head. She was frowning, and her cheeks were bright red with embarrassment. Listen to me, Susie. Your mama loved you so much, both of you. His mother shared a tired, loving look over to Darren, still shivering under his father's arm. And this gift that she gave you is very special as well. I'm very glad it's yours now, but I'm going to keep it for you until you're old enough to use it the right way, okay? Susie wiped her eyes again and nodded, locking eyes with her mother as her downturned mouth flattened out and even curled at the ends in a small smile. Darren shot a look up to his father again. His face was almost gaunt as his left eyelid twitched, before a long blink of defeated understanding. We love you both very much, and we're very sorry that you've had a bad night, but now let's all go to sleep, and maybe we'll even forget about this whole thing tomorrow, okay? Do you two want to come sleep with us in our room? He asked. Darren and Susie both gave a couple of small nods to their father. The parents picked up the children and started out of Susie's room. Darren was happy to not use his legs, and his body finally began to warm back up as his father carried him into the hallway, his head on his shoulder. Susie and their mom were behind them, and suddenly the bedroom light clicked off. Darren's father waited for them and let them pass before slowly closing the door behind them. Susie had her arms around her mother's neck. The hallway was now darkened, but in the silver pre-morning light, Darren saw a look of heavy relief on her young face. They walked down the long hall and through their parents' bedroom door. Come on, buddy, let's go. His father breathed in a deep, sleepy voice. He slowly carried Darren down the hallway. Head on his shoulder, Darren's eyes began to grow weary and narrow. As his father walked, the bouncing view of the hall grew longer and longer. Through his blurred vision, he saw the crawling scratches on Susie's door in the low light. He also noticed his own door, right next to hers, slightly cracked open, letting in the fumes of his blue nightlight. As they progressed further down the hall, he could see his door seemingly pulling open ever so slowly and silently. Darren decided it must be his exhaustion and turned his forehead down on his father's shoulder as they made their way through the master bedroom door. Before he knew it, Darren and all the rest of his family were snug under the thick comforter of a king-size bed, quietly escaping into the warm oblivion of sleep. Curled on top of them was Matilda the cat, whose dreams had been unbothered by the whole affair. In his final moment of consciousness, Darren almost thought he could faintly hear slow footsteps from far down the hall, making their way to the door of the master bedroom before turning away and leading down the staircase toward the front door of their home. It was a late afternoon. I was heading to my job at the gas station Circle K in Ohio. My name is Charles Jason. I'm not allowed to tell you exactly where my job is located, but this station was old. We barely had anyone visit, and it was my night shift. I was alone with just the cook, and tasked to make sure the old food was thrown out in the dumpster. But I didn't do that exactly. I would throw out one bag of it, but I had a second one I'd take to me to the pond behind the store, maybe a mile away. My co-worker would take over the cash register when I was gone and would throw old meat or buns into it, making sure not to drop the bag. You're probably wondering why I would throw food into the water instead of just throwing it away. I had a good reason. You see, a year ago when I started this job, I had no friends or pets, and I would always come here in my day shift on my 30-minute break. My boss said the moment I got here my shift would start, and I was happy for that. One day, a tiny baby croc came out of the water, and I noticed it was a bit darker than the ones I see on TV or magazines, but I was almost more shocked. There was a crocodile baby in Ohio. Ohio, am I right? But I noticed he has red eyes, and it was chirping for its mother. My guess was a guy got it as an exotic pet, and instead of just giving it to a zoo or animal control, he dropped it into the water. I stared at it and just tossed it a piece of my lunch meat, and it gobbled it right up. Poor thing must have been starving, but also it seemed to look at me. For a moment I thought I saw gratitude in its eye as it went up to my foot and laid on my shoe. I was actually surprised it showed any sort of gratitude. I continued to eat my lunch, but share with it any scarps. When my break was almost up, I had to throw a chunk of my bread into the water, and he scurried to it. When I went back to my shift, I was told by my boss I got night shift with John. The chef and I didn't mind him since he gave me free food for my break. During the year, he helped cover for me since every night I got out of my way to feed the poor baby. I never saw him again, but he still ate the food I gave him. At one point, I was just sitting at the pound enjoying the stars when I saw two bright red eyes sticking out of the water, like a shadow with eyes. I knew it was him because I'll never forget his gratitude. I decided to call him a cool name like Shadow Croc, since he was like a shadow, but I had to get back to work before he could come out. I regretted that cause when I came back the next night. I saw he was out of the water, but I saw his footprints and tail in the mud. But that's when it was strange. They were massive, like very massive. His feet were larger than any croc prints I saw on the magazines or online. The closest to them were ancient crocs, but even then, I still left him the food this time. I made sure to give him the whole bag. Cut back to today and I saw him again. He was the same size with the eyes and watched me. I decided to sit down and pat my legs. "Come here, boy. Come here, Shadow Croc," I would say to him, and he did. He came right out of the water, but before he fully could, he rushed back in when I heard footsteps coming toward me, and I saw 3 of the local gang members walking up to me. I knew what was going to happen as they pulled out 2 pistols, as the third had a metal bat, threatening me to kill me if I didn't, as I, quote, wring out my pockets, and I couldn't help but hold a chuckle at their slang. But I have nothing on me, so I pulled out my pockets, showing I had nothing. I guess they didn't like that because it's their turf, and told me I was just useless to be around here and pointed their guns at me. I was horrified to think I was going to die, till we all heard a very deep growl from the water. The members looked as I knew what it was I looked, and Shadow Croc was at the bank of the water halfway out as he was growling. The gang member would scream, saying, "What the goddamn hell is that? Is that a damn monster? Man, I told you I needed more than a gun." I saw them point their guns, backing up. A shadow got out of the bank. I finally got a good look at him. He was probably 11 feet tall. His body was bulky, looking as well as his feet, leaving a print into the ground. His back was covered in large spikes, and his hands were almost human-looking, but claws and webbing made them completely different from a human's. His tail was also large as well, with spikes at the tip. The gang members would open fire right at him, and all the bullets would hit him on the chest, stomach or head, but they all would bounce off or get stuck to his skin. He would roar right at him, and I'm telling you, he was not slow. He charged right at them, grabbing one of their arms and ripped it right off his shoulder, joints tossing the arm away as his tail slammed into the bat guy's stomach before he went for a wing. His spikes stabbed the man in the stomach and swung him on it away to the ground hard. The last guy was able to reload his gun and open fired point blank to his head. Like always, the bullets didn't even bother him, but they got stuck on his head as well, falling out of his head. He then opened his jaw, grabbing him and had him in it. but he looked at me like he was concerned for some reason and just pulled the guy out and squeezed him till I heard his ribs cracking and tossed him down. If you're wondering why he chose not making him a lunch, my guess was he didn't want the taste of blood. I think he enjoyed the food more than actual meat or blood. He looked at me as I just slowly stepped up and I reached up to him. He actually kneeled down, letting me petting him like I did a year ago. He made a noise I can describe like a car engine. I never realized just feeding him only junk from Circle K was enough to make him grow this much. But I knew it wasn't since deer came around this area. How else would he eat when I couldn't feed him every day? He then ran back to the pound. I looked around and made a 911 call telling the police I found 3 men on the ground badly injured, dying. It took the police an hour to make it here, and all 3 men were dead. I didn't question why it took them so long, because it's ether traffic or the cops they signaled were an hour away. Otherwise they were shocked to find the carnage in front of them. I was questioned, and I gave them the best answer I had. I found them this way, officer. I heard gunfire and found them. I think they were attacked by a crazed knife men or groups of them. The cops hyped my story and continued on. Ever since that day I kept feeding him as I still did every week. But one night, he left. I think he finally moved on. I know because he left behind his trail leading to the forest. I never knew where he went, but I know he'll always be my friend, and I hope he's doing okay wherever he is. It was Halloween, and all the children were outside, dressed up and knocking excitedly on doors in hope of scoring some candy. Their parents were walking alongside them and keeping an eye out for them in case of something bad happening. There were all sorts of urban legends going around even from when I was a kid. Stories of strange men kidnapping children when they knocked on their door, or the candy being laced with drugs or razor blades. Everyone had heard of these things, but no one actually knew anyone who had experienced them. Personally, I think it was just some government lie spread to make parents accompany their kids so that they wouldn't be able to play tricks such as egging houses or TPing their neighbors' yards. I was sitting at home with the curtains drawn and the porch lights turned off. I had no time or energy for some greedy rascals to knock on my door and ask for candy. I had gotten myself a big bowl of discounted Halloween candy from the local supermarket, and there was already a big pile of wrappers forming on the ground beneath my feet. My favorite candy was Kit Kat. I loved pulling apart each finger and taking small bites to really savor the candy bar. Some people preferred taking a big bite out of all 4 of the fingers without breaking them apart first. I thought that they were no better than an animal. My mother had always been very strict with manners and etiquette, and she nitpicked even the smallest things, such as how I ate candy. I had to take small bites and eat it with class. Otherwise, I was no better than the homeless people on the street. During the evening, some kids still came and knocked on my door and rang the doorbell. I wanted to open the door and scream at them, but I knew that if I did that, the jig was up, and they would know I was home. I wanted a calm evening where I could watch the latest episode of my favorite soap opera. I had positioned myself on the couch with my feet on the table in front of me and the bowl of candy on my lap. I thought that if my mother had seen me right now, she would have had another heart attack and died again. But thank God that old hag was dead, and I could do whatever I pleased. Just as I reached for the remote to increase the volume, I felt a sharp pain in my stomach. I tried to ignore it, but it kept getting worse. I put aside the bowl and stood up to go get myself a glass of water from the kitchen. Suddenly, something splashed beneath me onto the floor. "Fucking shit!" I yelled. This can't be happening. Not right now. But I knew that it was time. I put my shoes and jacket on and grabbed my keys and started heading to my car. The pain was intensifying, and I was wondering if I was even in a condition to drive. But still, I buckled myself in and put the gear into reverse and started driving. The night was cold and chilly, and it was thundering. I could barely see the road ahead since it was foggy. Maybe if I was lucky I would get hit by another car so I wouldn't make it to the hospital and escape all those bills I knew were going to pile up afterwards. But it seems luck was not on my side today, since I made it to the hospital and even found a parking spot right outside, which was highly unusual. Usually you would have to park all the way in the back and walk a good 5 minutes. Tough luck if you were ill or injured, I would think to myself every time I had to look for a spot. I walked in through the main entrance and made my way to the reception. Behind it was a young girl sitting on one of those spinning chairs with a pile of paperwork and signing away. I just stood in front of her, hoping for her to notice me. The pains kept getting worse and I almost wanted to kneel over, but I just held it in. It fascinated me how a person could be so unaware of their surroundings. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, just staring at her. I remembered how psychologists back in the days used to think that humans had a biological instinct of knowing when someone was observing them, even if that person was not in their eyesight. I guess this didn't apply to this girl, since 5 minutes had passed and she didn't even look up once. I could have kept this going for longer, but then yet another cramp hit me, and I let out a wheeze of pain, which finally caught her attention. She looked up at me like a deer in headlights and said, "Oh God, I'm sorry. Have you been standing here for long?" 5 minutes or so, I responded. "Oh dear, I'm very sorry, I didn't see you at all. What can I help you with?" "That's interesting." I thought. I was standing just right in front of her, and still she was so preoccupied with her work that she didn't notice me. What if I was a crazy gunman ready to shoot her? She really should start paying more attention to what goes on around her. "I'm in labor," I responded. The look on her face got even more embarrassed. She was almost grimacing. "Holy shit!" "Sorry. Pardon my French. I'm just surprised you could stand here for 5 minutes without screaming. I'm going to call a nurse over right now. Please have a seat in the wheelchair over here and she will be here ASAP." The nurse rolled me over to the delivery room and I laid in the bed, and the doctor checked how dilated I was. He said I wasn't dilated enough and I needed to wait some more before we could start pushing. Once every hour he came back to check, and it still wasn't enough. The hours kept going by, and eventually 20 hours had passed, and this bastard of a kid was still not ready to leave. Because of this pregnancy, I had lost half of the hair on my head, 2 teeth, and my once youthful and beautiful face was now bleak and riddled with acne. He had taken everything from me, and now he wanted to stay there for longer. Finally, the doctor came back, and he told me that if he stayed in there for longer, it would be a danger to my health. Huh? A danger to my health? I had never heard that before. Wouldn't it be a danger to the baby's health to stay in the womb too long? "We need to do a C-section immediately," he said. Wow. First he ruins my health and gives me a nightmarish pregnancy, and then he decides to go out on a bang by forcing the doctors to cut me up to deliver him. If his father hadn't left me already, he probably would have now if he saw the state I was in. The doctors rolled me into the operating room and laid me on top of the table. They injected me with nerve killers so I wouldn't feel anything during the surgery. Although it worked as promised and I didn't experience any pain, I could still feel everything they were doing. I could hear the sound of the scalpel cutting into my flesh and their hands gouging into the hole they just created. I could feel their hands prodding inside and pushing my organs in different directions so they could deliver the baby. I finally knew what those alien abduction lunatics on TV were talking about. I felt like I'd been abducted by aliens and being vivisected for their enjoyment. I barely felt human anymore. I felt like an animal in a slaughterhouse. They might as well just tear my heart out while they're at it, since I felt dead already, like I had died and went to hell. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they pulled him out. I was listening for the sound of cries, but the room was dead silent. There were at least 10 hospital staff standing around me, and they were also quiet. They just looked at each other nervously. The doctor quickly pulled him away from my line of sight and started working on him. I had no idea what he was doing, but one of the nurses came over and started, stroking my head, and told me not to worry and that everything was going to be okay. But what she didn't realize was that it wasn't the fact that he wasn't breathing that worried me. The doctor just stood there, dumbfounded, and had stopped working on the baby. He called over another doctor, and they started whispering to each other intensely. The possibilities of what they were whispering about were running through my head. He must have been born with horns. Why else would they be so panicked? After a while, the doctor picked up the baby and walked over to me. Mum, in my 25 years of being an OB-GYN, I have yet to witness a baby not cry when they were born. I looked at him, and I was trying to wrap my head around what he just said. It shouldn't be medically possible. He continued, a baby must cry when they are born, because that is how they start breathing. But your son is perfectly healthy and breathing, even though he hasn't made a single sound since we delivered him. When I was back in my hospital bed, my son was cradled in my arms. The nurse had put him there, and I hadn't put him down. I was just staring at him. I knew the doctor had told me that he was physically healthy, but there was still a part of me that felt that there was something wrong with him. Something mentally disturbed. What kind of baby causes their mother all this harm, and then doesn't even cry when he is born? Like he is happy that he didn't have to endure any pain. He even got to take the easy way out and didn't have to fight his way out of me. On top of that, he was born on Halloween, the day where you celebrate all things demonic. I stayed up with him all night just staring at him. Not once did he cry. I tried shaking him a little and even pinched him, but he just looked right back at me with a blank stare. The nurse came over and tried helping me to nurse him. I held him to my nipple and tried feeding him, but instead I screamed in pain. I pulled him away and I saw that my nipple was bleeding. The nurse looked at me in shock and grabbed him from me. This fucker was even born with teeth. I guess he's a biter, huh? She giggled. I wanted to slap that smile off her stupid face. One night on his 13th birthday, he and I were watching TV. Every time we watched a movie together, it was a slasher, because that's the only type of movies he enjoyed. I had asked him once why he enjoyed seeing people get brutally murdered and the gore that followed. I don't know. There is just something so satisfying about the way the blade sounds when it cuts through the flesh. I wonder how it would sound for real. The movies just use sound effects, so it doesn't really give a good representation of the real deal. The answer he gave was even more horrifying than what was happening on the screen. So you want to try it for yourself to see what it would sound like then? I responded. I don't think so. The cleanup would be too much of a hassle. I just turned my head back to the screen and tried to forget the disturbing things he had just said. But that was easier said than done. That night I laid in bed on my side and turned towards the window. It was a full moon, and the yellow light shined into my bedroom and illuminated the room. Besides me on the bedside table was a picture of my son smiling. I remember taking that picture on the last day of school. I had forced him to smile for the camera. You see, he never ever smiled at me. In his 13 years on this earth, I had yet to see even a corner of his mouth lift. He also had never cried or gotten angry. He was always deadpan like a robot or a zombie. I thought back to my C-section. I remember when I felt like I was being vivisected by aliens. What if it wasn't just a thought? What if it was a memory? Perhaps they put something into me before they closed me up. Something non-human. An alien fetus that looked like a human being. That was the only thing that could explain why he was the way that he was. I had been to countless psychologists, child behavior analysts and doctors, but no one could find anything wrong with him. They always asked to speak to the child alone, and once they were back, they always gushed about how well-behaved and intelligent he was. They told me I should appreciate my son since most of the mothers they saw coming in here dreamed of having a child like mine. They refused to listen when I told them that I believed that my son was going to become a dangerous man. A future school shooter or serial killer or something. But they always shut me down by telling me that he displayed none of the characteristics of those kinds of people. I told them about how I had read his diary and how he wrote that he fantasized different ways to kill people and how that would make him feel. He wrote about what weapons he would use and how we would go about doing it. The psychologist simply said that it was normal for children his age to have an active imagination and that it was healthy for him to journal his thoughts and feelings. I never told my son what all those meetings with the professionals were for, and he never asked. But I could tell that he knew exactly what they were for. I could tell by the way he looked at me. At age 18, he brought home a girl. He had had girlfriends previously, and this one, just like the girls before, had the exact same features. They all had brown hair and green eyes, and the same general facial features. This disturbed me because they all resembled me. They looked just like me when I was their age. I know that he knew this because I would often catch him sitting in the living room, looking through old picture books of me in my teens. Every time he brought home a new girl, he would observe my reaction. He would look at my facial expression and body language for any type of clue that I was uncomfortable, but I knew what he was doing and refused to give him the satisfaction. Usually they would break up within a few months. When I asked him why he would break up with them, he always replied that he got bored of them. He was just like his piece of shit father, even though he had never met him. However, with his newest girlfriend, he never got the chance of breaking up with her. One day, when I was out on my daily walk, my next-door neighbor hurried over to me from my yard and started giving me condolences. I looked at her confused, because I had no idea what she was referring to. "Your son's girlfriend. Haven't you heard? What about his girlfriend?" I asked. "She killed herself last night. I thought he would have told you." My whole body filled with rage, and I excused myself and ran back home. I walked towards his bedroom with rage almost pouring out of me, and the thumps of my steps echoed in the house. "What the fuck is wrong with you? Your girlfriend kills herself and you don't tell your own mother. You have been home all day and you haven't even mentioned it." He looked at me with that same deadpan expression he always had. "I guess it's shock or whatever," he responded casually. I left his room and picked up the phone and called her parents. We talked for a long time and they told me that she had hung herself in their garage. She had left no suicide note and they had no idea whatever that she was. After I hung up, I just sat there. I recalled seeing a piece of rope in my son's room a couple of weeks ago, but today it was no longer there. I knew for a fact that he had killed her. I drove over to the police station and told them everything, from how he enjoyed watching slasher movies, to the diary, and finally to the rope. Tears were forming in my eyes and I hoped and prayed that they would believe me. But guess what? They didn't. They said that none of this was concrete evidence and that they had already investigated her death and found no foul play. "What about the diary and the rope?" I yelled. "It's all just circumstantial," he responded. From then on, I knew that no matter who I told, no one would believe me. My son was a straight-A student and an athlete at school. Right now, everyone felt sorry for him and were giving him heaps of condolences he didn't even deserve. I hated him. I truly did. There was not a single day that went by where I didn't wish I had aborted him or killed him as an infant when I had the chance. What was the most gut-wrenching was the fact that I was the only one who knew what kind of demon he truly was and that he was the one that killed her. I just had to prove it to them. A month after the suicide of my son's girlfriend, he was back to normal. He was tired of the charade and decided to attend a party that was being thrown at his friend's house. Once he had left, I decided that this was my chance to prove to everyone what he was. I took my car and parked it a few houses away from where the party was thrown. I sat there for hours just observing and waiting for my opportunity to strike. I could see a girl stumbling out through the doors and started walking towards my direction. She was visibly inebriated. Once she reached my car, I cranked down the window and asked if she wanted a lift, which she accepted. She got into the passenger side of the car and I started driving. She was so intoxicated that she passed out immediately. I kept driving and eventually I stopped the car. I got out and walked towards the trunk of the car and pulled out a pair of gloves and pulled them over my hands. Then I pulled my hair into a tight bun and made my way over to the passenger side of the car and opened the door. I dragged her out of the car and started making my way into the forest where I had parked. I made sure not to go too far in since I wanted her to be found relatively quickly. I placed her on the damp leaves on the ground and pulled out a knife from my back pocket. The knife belonged to my son, and he had bought it online at an auction after seeing Pulp Fiction. He was dead set on getting this specific knife since it was a replica of the one used in the movie. I looked at the girl and thought that she was perfect. Brunette with green eyes. Just how he liked them. A part of me felt bad about what I was about to do, but I kept reminding myself that this was for the greater good. She was in fact a hero, because she was giving her life to save the numerous other women who could face the same demise in the hands of my son. I think she would understand somehow and be grateful to be remembered as a hero. With the knife in hand, I plunged it into her chest. The sound it made was ear-grating, but I knew I had to keep going. I wanted to make it as quick and painless as possible for her. She let out a loud moan, but she was so out of it that she didn't even try to defend herself. Thank God the syringe I injected into her in the car worked. I kept plunging the knife into her over and over again, and the blood splattered all over me. Finally, when I was done, I left the knife in her chest and retrieved a piece of tape from my pocket. On it, I had my son's fingerprints. I had placed a piece of tape on his door handle where he touched most frequently to retrieve his prints. I placed the tape strategically on the knife handle so that his fingerprints would be easily identifiable. I got back to my car and opened up the trunk again. I picked up the bottle of bleach and started scrubbing down the whole passenger side so that no one would be able to find any trace of her in the car. When I was done, I looked back at her body one last time, and I felt proud of my masterpiece. I knew I had done something good tonight, even if it meant that she had to sacrifice her life for it. But what was one life in comparison to the countless other possible ones? I knew I had no other choice but to do this. I had tried talking, reasoning, and convincing other people, but nobody listened. They made me do this. They wanted this. This is the result of their inaction. That night was the best night's sleep I had ever gotten. The feeling of finally accomplishing something and soon hopefully being rid of my psychopath son was so liberating. The only unbearable part was having to wait for him to get caught. But when I finally heard those bangs on the door, followed by the words, "Police,"
Open up!
it was unlike any feeling I had ever felt before. It was pure bliss, euphoria. The fact that they finally had found the body and connected it to my son felt like 1,000 orgasms at once. When they hauled him away in handcuffs, he looked at me, but this time not with that same deadpan expression he always had. No. This time it was anger, disgust and horror all at once. Seeing all those feelings splattered on his face gave me immense joy. When nobody was looking at me, I gave him a satisfied smirk. I finally won. I finally won this little cat and mouse we were playing, and I had finally beaten him. He had finally got caught in the mousetrap, and I just stood there in the doorway and let out a sigh of relief. It felt like the world had been lifted off my shoulders and that I was finally free for the first time in my life. I had been a prisoner for 18 excruciating years, and it was finally time for him to feel what I had felt all this time.